I think we'll get started. Welcome to the December meeting of the Massachusetts Board of Early Education and Care. It's delightful to see everybody here. As some of you know, this is my last meeting and the Secretary's last meeting, and I'll look forward to saying a few things about that at the end, I think. Yes? Big picture, obviously, end of 2022 has lots of work in play, as we'll hear from the Commissioner and the team, and some real follow-on work, in particular around subsidy and C3, and look forward to talking more about that. But thrilled to be here. Nice to see you all. I'll turn it over to the Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is not
live for the room.
So I just got to shout it out. Okay.
Home.
All right. Excellent. Hope you can all hear me. As Noni indicated, this is my last meeting as well. I just came a few minutes ago from another last meeting at the Board of Higher Education. So I'll try not to get too weepy. I cried it all out at the last meeting. So I think I'll keep it together this time. But I did want to take the moment to reflect back a little bit on some of the accomplishments of this board and this department and the field over the course of the last 8 years, which are really, I think, quite remarkable. And I'll only mention really a few of them. But I think it's fair to say that a focus for this board and this department over the course of that time has been to strengthen the quality and capacity of the early education system as a whole, with a focus on increasing funding for core operating costs, staff compensation, workforce development, all while improving affordability and access for children and families. Just a couple of the specific highlights. In collaboration, obviously, with the legislature, we've implemented $250 million in provider rate increases since 2015 as part of a 118% increase in overall state spending on early education, which is a remarkable number. Doesn't mean that we're where we need to be, but it does mean we've come a long way in a fairly short period of time. We've revised the parent fee schedule to eliminate fees for families with household income below the poverty line and limit fees to an average of 7% for those with household incomes up until the point at which they no longer receive subsidies. We've revised the subsidy regulations, or I should say we are revising the subsidy regulations to reduce bureaucratic barriers and access and to ensure stability for children and families. As you know, and as we'll discuss some more today, we designed and implemented the federally funded Commonwealth Cares for Children, or C3, stabilization grant program to restore and sustain child care capacity in the aftermath of COVID. And I probably shouldn't say aftermath since we were just talking about another COVID case. But through the crisis and beyond, and taking us beyond COVID, hopefully to build a system that will better serve not only the providers, but of course the children and families and the employers and the economy as a whole. We've consolidated several separate programs into a single quality improvement line item to enable flexible investments in program quality and workforce development. And we've established early childhood support organizations, or ECSOs, in partnership with New Profit to improve quality and capacity of independent child care providers. Again, this is only, I think, in some ways a flavor or a smattering of the many initiatives and successes that this board, this department have had over the course of the last 8 years. Obviously, in the middle of all that was responding to the COVID crisis. Just a couple of things to remind us of. This agency, again in cooperation with our partners in the field, stood up an entirely new system of emergency child care for frontline essential workers. And then, within a few short weeks after that, began the process of restarting the larger child care system under a new set of rules and guidelines reflecting the public health demands, but also providing new flexibility to reflect the daunting operational challenges that providers and programs were facing. Besides adjusting the rules of the road in real time, and I should emphasize the real timeness of it all, this was really a 24/7 operation, which was obviously difficult on folks in the field, but also difficult and challenging for folks in the department. In the context of all that, the department worked closely with private providers to build a distribution system for PPE and to establish a national model testing program. And throughout, EEC has worked with the governor and the legislature to ensure that new resources kept flowing to keep classrooms open and to support the workforce throughout the pandemic. It's not a stretch to say that EEC and the child care system kept the Massachusetts economy moving, even during the darkest days of the pandemic, and enabled the timely reopening of businesses, schools, and communities. The entire department and all the providers and educators in the field deserve our deepest gratitude for their service to the children and families of the Commonwealth. It really is a debt that can never be repaid. And although we may be talking about this a little bit more later, throughout it all, Noni Lasso was a full partner and a skilled leader who helped balance all the competing interests and challenges of the pandemic, while never losing sight of the long-term strategic goals for the department and the broader early education system. We all knew that Noni would bring deep expertise and policy insight into her role as board chair, but I don't think any of us knew what an engaged and effective leader she would be of such a complicated government bureaucracy and a $1.2 billion program, in particular during periods of transition and unprecedented crisis. We're now coming out the other side, and I think remarkably, we're actually in better shape than when we went in, poised for even greater improvement and impact in the years ahead, and in many respects, that's due in no small measure to your leadership. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I will say a tiny bit more at the end and have lots to say about other people here too, but I will just frame this by saying it has been an absolute privilege for me. So thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to start by thanking the Senate President's Office for hosting us today, and particularly Jonah Beckley, who I think has been helping us with the logistics. So it's a special time to be here in the State House with all of you, and thank you to Deb Woodman and the Senate Business Office also for their support. Ben Flukas and the team at LIS also being flexible with us as we make sure to try and live stream and be available with the technology we need here. This afternoon, I'm really happy to welcome two new board members who are not here, but we look forward to working with them. Appointed just last week by the governor, George Atanasov and Cheryl Travers. George is the head of worldwide government affairs and policy at Johnson & Johnson and will be assuming the business seat on the board. Cheryl Travers works at the Breen School in Lawrence as a public school preschool teacher and will be assuming the seat for an early education and care teacher. So we look forward to working with them on the board in the months ahead. I also wanted to provide a little bit of a COVID update because indeed we are still in the midst of it, although the landscape continues to change. We have heard from several providers who have been participating in the federal government's Operation Expanded Testing Program. We understand, we've heard from Ginkgo Bioworks and Concentric, who's been running that program, which is access to pooled PCR testing, that program actually will be ending at the end of December. About 160 programs have continued to participate in that program, and we're going to encourage those programs to join our rapid test program. So the department, in partnership with Neighborhood Villages and Tig Logistics, we've provided more than 2.5 million rapid tests to programs to keep kids in programs and staff in programs. And we've also continued to provide access to a health line if there's questions about COVID exposures and programs, and we will continue to do that through the full rest of the fiscal year. I also wanted to make sure the board was aware that the agency has again this year used its discretion to allow our programs who serve children receiving EEC child care financial assistance to close in the week between Christmas and New Year's without any financial penalty. So we have heard, I'm sure all of you have heard, being out of programs, it's a very stressful time out in the early education and care field. Most programs are struggling with staff shortages, covering for each other, especially in this difficult tridemic year, and we felt like it was a really important resource to be able to allow programs to close, give some opportunity for rest and relaxation for the early education and care staff, let them spend some time with their families as well. No program is being required to close, and we've asked the programs to work with their parents who may need substitute care during that week, but we felt that was an important step to be able to take. I also wanted to provide the board with a quick update on a pilot program that exciting pilot program we're in the midst of designing The final FY23 budget included $10 million to provide childcare financial assistance to early education and care staff, so staff working in a variety of different roles in early education and care programs, including family child care, and we've been deep into the design of this program. We've been trying to figure out how to make sure we design it so it could potentially be scaled in the long term, building it into the existing child care financial assistance system. We had a very good meeting with our advisory council last week, and we hope to launch the pilot program soon after the new year. We are watching Kentucky very closely, who has launched categorical eligibility to child care financial assistance for early education and care providers. We think this can be a very powerful tool for recruiting and retaining staff who have children to be able to stay in the field or come into the field. And so we have an eye on the design about how to make sure we understand how that impact is coming to. So we'll look forward to reporting back to the board as much as we can. I'm also very happy to report that we are moving forward with the applied behavioral analysis work to create regulations and a regulatory structure. We are this close to hiring a supervisor to oversee that new unit that will do that work. And we also have a contract out on the street. Please share with your networks. I'm happy to send it to you after to help us design the regulations and also the regulatory framework and structure. So pleased to be able to move that work forward in collaboration with our colleagues at EHS and with board member Carolyn Kane, who's been a supporter of that work as well. I also just want to conclude my remarks today by recognizing Noni, and it's been too short a time for us to have the opportunity to work together, but your impact is felt every day at the agency as we are working and thinking about how to be innovative, how to take things to scale, how to start small but grow it to where it needs to be, to keep an eye on the horizon and the vision of what we want for the system of early education and care. And it's been a pleasure to get to know you, and I just want to express my gratitude for your support in this transition and during this time, and for your time during the course. As the secretary said, it was an exciting and difficult time for early education and care during your leadership, and we're grateful for you for the stability that you provided during that time. So thank you so much. And Secretary, also your last meeting, and also too short, but I just want to say what an honor it's been to serve with you during this time, and your support for early childhood education and for the agency and the work that we've been doing, and the support for us to grow the capacity and build what we need to poise ourselves for future growth has been remarkable. So thank you for this opportunity to serve with both of you. Very grateful for that. Okay. We will
Pleasure.
turn it back to you.
Thank you. We have statements from the public. I think we may have one.
Hello. You are not at EEC's headquarters, which is where I was. I've improved my commuting distance and timing, even after a long layover of not doing much. Good afternoon, Chair Lasso, Secretary Pizer, members of the boards, Acting Commissioner Kershaw. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Amy O'Leary, and I'm the Executive Director at Strategies for Children. I'm here today to offer thanks and appreciation. In this time of transition, we have been reflecting on the last 8 years of the Baker administration, especially since March of 2020. To say that the decisions made by leaders in the Baker-Polito administration and the legislature over the past 3 years saved lives may sound dramatic, but I believe that it's true. From setting up emergency childcare in a matter of days, to supporting COVID testing for children, families, and staff, to listening to the field when drafting responsive, new policies to ensure safety and health, to funding programs to stay open, and to the creation of C3. As I sit here today, I'm still thinking about the incredible stories of educators, program leaders, family child care providers, school-age staff, and CEOs who have shown up every day for children and families, like both of you. We continue to be inspired by this dedicated and resilient workforce and their commitment to problem-solving, building partnerships, and providing high-quality learning experiences under incredible circumstances. And now here at the last meeting, which I know is official for Chairwoman Lasso, I don't know if it's so official for you,
I
Secretary
think we can
Price.
count on it.
We at Strategies like to report accurate information, so we know that in this time of transition, we wanted to take a moment, Secretary Pizer, to serve on all 3 education boards and to be the go-to person for the governor for education is no small job. I don't know many people that would be able to keep up with the schedule, to keep up with the content, and to make those connections that are so critical when we think about changing lives for children and families.
Thank you.
So thank you for your leadership and for all that you've done. I know you have learned a ton about early education and care, and I'm excited to see what you will do with that newfound information in your next move, whether it's in state government or not. We just wanted to thank you and send our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
And Chair Lasso, you were appointed chair in 2015, but our story dates back to 2010, when Strategies for Children commissioned you to develop and write Turning the Page, Refocusing Massachusetts for Reading Success. It was a time when we were working to change the conversation and focus on 10th grade MCAS scores to 3rd grade reading and shifting our priority as a state to an intervention as opposed to remediation. The report that led to the foundation for legislation and act relative to 3rd grade reading proficiency, filed by lead sponsors Senator Catherine Clark and Representative Marty Walsh in 2010 and enacted in 2012. The legislation established the early literacy expert panel and really made recommendations in 5 key areas: comprehensive curricula anchored in rich content, effective instructional practices, professional development and training, assessment that is comprehensive, developmentally appropriate, and family partnership strategies. We continue to advocate for a birth through post-secondary education system that continues to address these critical components. As Governor Reeker said with the announcement of your appointment, with years of experience in the education field, Noni has risen as a leader for early education and literacy reforms in the Commonwealth and brings a unique skill set to the table that will strengthen policies and enrich education for young children. Your expertise, knowledge, and understanding of the early education and care field has continued to grow, and you've prioritized investments and support the people for the people who are doing this work every day. Your leadership and insistence on equity has been critical to this field along the way, with you pushing us to have a big, bold, achievable vision for children and families in Massachusetts. For both of you, it's not easy to be a leader in a global pandemic. We are grateful that you accepted the challenge and showed empathy, compassion, understanding at what was at stake, and a passion for making tough decisions and always offering support. In gratitude, we thank you and continue to work with you wherever your next roles take you. Thank you.
Amy, thank you.
Oh. As a friend of government,
So wonderful of you to prepare like that, and I'm so grateful. We will now shift gears, assuming there's no more public comment, and move into some routine business. Do we have Paul on the phone? Okay, Paul's going to join at some point. So we have minutes from the November 8th, 2022 meeting. Not sure if folks had amendments, edits, corrections. Okay, why don't I make the motion that we approve the minutes from the November 8th, 2022 meeting?
Second.
Thank you, Carolyn. Maria Moeller,
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz,
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Secretary Pizer.
Yes.
Maura Siegel.
Yes.
Jamila Lee.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yes.
Thank you. Approved. Next, I'm going to turn over to Maria on an update in the workforce domain.
All right, so I'll read the update. EEC, under the guidance of this working group, is working on 2 parallel and equally important tracks. Long-term, to develop a career and credentialing career pathway to support the professionalizing of the field and meaningful career growth, to be launched in coordination with the Professional Development Registry. Short-term, focus on strategies to build a pipeline of educators through new recruitment and retention initiatives, including public outreach campaign to elevate the field, promote working in the field, and centralize career opportunities for programs and educators. This was the focus of our last meeting. Increase license capacity through targeted outreach, recruitment, and support for family childcare providers, and promote and support apprenticeships efforts across the state to bring in and support new educators to join and stay in the field. These last two areas will be the focus of our next meeting on Tuesday, December 20th from 10 to 12. That is support for new family childcare businesses and new teacher apprenticeship. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with that word. Apprenticeships. In each area, EEC had identified and met with key partners already working in each space. And a focus of the work is to coordinate, align, support, and amplify innovative work underway, not to duplicate that work. Currently, we are planning to dedicate a good portion of the January 10th full meeting of the Board of Early Education and Care to an update and discussion of our workforce strategy and efforts. Thank you.
Comments, questions around some of the workforce agenda? Sounds like stay tuned on the next meeting. I'm going to turn back now to the Commissioner on a 2022 end-of-year review.
Great, thank you so much, Madam Chair. Chance to kind of look back over the last 8 months and talk with you a little bit about sort of where we find ourselves as we look into the year ahead. I'm actually resurfacing slides that I brought to the board in May as I was sort of assessing the current status of the agency and thinking about the work ahead. And I said at the time, and it's still true, that the board and the agency's strategic action plan has laid out what is a solid and durable vision for the field of early education and care as we think of what we want for children, youth, and families. We want young learners who are curious and ready for school and life success. We want to be supporting the economic mobility goals of their families. We want educators who have meaningful career pathways, that we would all be proud to have our children enter that career and make a meaningful life out of being in that career. We want a network of diverse, stably financed programs that our early educators and care staff can be happy to work in, and that our working families have access to in the communities where they live and work. And we want the system to be efficiently and effectively functioning. And I've gone back and brought these pillars back each time in thinking about what that longer term, what the horizon looks like for the early education and care sector, and thinking about the key pillars of what that system is. Our work over the last 8 months has been figuring out how to close the gap between where we are today and that broad, durable vision that you all created through the strategic action plan. When I brought this first sort of structure to all of you in May, what we talked about is operationalizing that durable vision for the field by focusing on our key user groups. So those are our families, our programs, and our educators. And how do we create a truly human-centered system that provides modern, flexible, technology-enabled services for our families from the times and locations in a dignified way that makes the most sense for them? How do we make sure our programs have that financing so they can invest in both their ongoing operations as well as their staff, and we hope in curriculums that support those young learners to be prepared for school? And for our educators, how do we begin to articulate the shorter and the long-term vision, as Maria talked about this happening in that work group, so that we can professionalize the field in the long term, but in the short term, also address the urgent needs of the day. So connecting sort of the broader vision that's in the strategic action plan to how we sort of begin to think about operationalizing it. How do we think about reorganizing our staff, our resources, our priorities, our working groups, to make sure we're focusing on tying out the vision into executable actions on a daily basis that lead to outcomes for all of our user groups. At the time, I also said to you, we have some basic operational needs. We're not going to get to a long-term vision of a career ladder and a pathway, because our background record check, which is the front door to the early education and care educators in our system, wasn't working. And so we had to take a step back and deep into the operations to talk a little bit about our background record check process and make sure that that front door, the basic health and safety checks that we need for any educator coming into the field, was working and was in compliance with federal requirements. And I'm really happy to report that we are on an excellent track for that. We've met our federal compliance deadlines. We've migrated much of the system into our new modern navigator system, and we're working on retiring legacy. I will send you a note, Secretary, when the legacy system is finally retired, hopefully soon.
I'll come for the ribbon cutting.
We'll come for the ribbon cutting. Come for the service, for the memorial service for our legacy system. So really deep into the operational weeds of some things, but a foundational element for that workforce development system. If we can't get the front door down, then we're not going to be able to get the bigger pieces of the system in place. Similarly, we want families, living and working in the most expensive childcare market in the country. We recognize the importance of focusing on affordability. We have nearly 50,000. We have nearly 50,000 kids every day receiving child care subsidies from us, and nearly 20,000 families on the waiting list. And our system had become so complicated and convoluted that we had families who had just given up on trying to get through that system. And we know that we also had families on the waiting list funding program spots and not able to put those together. So again, we felt like a key operational sort of step towards that longer term vision was making sure that that system was easy to navigate and accessible for families who are eligible for those services. And today we hope you're going to take action on what is a fundamental foundational piece of building a longer term, equitable, affordable financial assistance system, and that is in the form of the regulations, which will provide a foundation for what else comes in terms of our work. And then obviously the big work of the agency right now is our workforce crisis. And as we developed our operational strategy for getting the background record check process in place so that we could clear the way for the rest of our workforce, and as we worked on sort of that end-to-end review of our subsidy system, we were working on our theory of action around the workforce system. What was it going to take for us to get from where we are today to that future state that we envision? And we have the pieces of that long-term strategy, working with higher education, working with the formal workforce system, laying out that true career pathway tied to credentials and certifications, again, we hope soon, and hopefully salaries at some point soon down the road as well. But we have an immediate crisis. There's no way for us to build that longer term pathway if we have so many empty classrooms and we have educators leaving the field at 30% turnover rates. So the focus on the immediate steps that our workforce group has been taking are essential for us to be able to actually have humans working in the early education and care field and building those entrance ramps that make sense for staff as they come in. Today, we're also going to be talking about the C3 program, which I'm really excited about, and underlying sort of our entire work and thinking about what is the early education and care. Noni and I have talked about since I got here. Can we call it a system yet? I'm not sure we can. But we have the vision and the idea that it needs to be a thriving system. And we have many of the pieces of that in place and many parts looking at the pillars, thinking about our key user groups. And now we really need to nail sort of the financing strategy and what it looks like to be able to provide support for our programs in a long-term operational way that allows for the investment in their workforce and investment in the learners in their programs. And so I'm excited that we're going to have an opportunity to think about what we've learned from the Commonwealth Cares program and what that means for us as we think about what a thriving long-term early education and care sector looks like. So because my team has been extremely hard at work, we have a long list of all the things that have happened over the last 8 months. Again, pretty deep in the operational weeds, but tied directly to that longer-term vision of where we want to go. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but I will pause for a second to say, as our governor often says, people are policy. And so my big focus in the last 8 months has also been making sure that we have the capacity at the agency and the talent to be able to deliver on that vision, both the day-to-day operational weeds that get us there and the longer-term strategic thinking about how you put the pieces together to get to that longer-term horizon. So we've built a pretty amazing team. We're continuing to recruit new staff, and we are surrounded by them today, all of them here to celebrate with the secretary and the chair after the meeting. So I will not go into detail, but it is there for you to see what the last 8 months have looked like for this amazing team, and I want to thank them for their work and dedication. It's been a difficult and exciting time at the agency. And that is the end of your review, so thank you very much. Want me to keep going on to the next, or?
I was going to say, welcome to Paul, who's joined us on the phone. And questions or comments about the end-of-year review, observations, thoughts, anything from folks?
Guidance, direction? We'd be happy to take it.
No, thank you. I think your operational expertise, it was super helpful in terms of bringing in infrastructure that, from the field point of view, was very much needed. I mean, I see the impact of some of these changes already, or some of this work already in our families and our staff especially. So thank you.
Anything else?
It's been a big 8 months.
It has, it's been
Yeah, and
exciting.
thank you, and kudos to the whole team for
Yes.
really pulling together a lot in that time. It's amazing.
Yeah, and I also appreciate, this has been 8 months, I love, your image of, you can't even get in the door of fulfilling a strategy if you don't solve for the background checks. And so spending 8 months getting the house in order has been wonderful, and really excited about what that will now allow us to do, going forward in such a critical time. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it positions the agency in a way, and again, two of the things we're gonna be talking about today are sort of those foundational things on the subsidy regulations to build the future state there, and then thinking about the role that operational grants and something like Commonwealth Cares can play, positioning the agency for that future innovation.
Great,
Great.
thank you. Paul, welcome. Let's move now to the child care financial assistance item and the subsidy that picks up on, obviously, lots of previous discussion.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to invite Joy Cohen and Rob Orthman to join us. Joy is our Director of Policy, and Rob is Deputy Counsel in our legal office. As you are aware, we spent a long time at last meeting walking through the proposed set of regulations. As I mentioned, these provide a foundational element for what will really be the change as it comes. The approach we've taken in the regulations is to sort of unburden them, I would say, in a lot of ways, and make sure that they are compliant with our federal regulations without going so far that they're getting in the way for families and providers. So our goal with these regulations is to enable those changes that create that modern, flexible, and dignified system that we want our families to experience. And they start with this very bureaucratic step of a set of red line regulations that we sent to all of you for your review. The action that we'll be asking for you to take today is to initial approval, but really to send these out for public comment. Traditionally, a public comment period is 21 days. We are proposing a 60-day public comment period, given the significance of the revisions to the regulations, what we hope they will catalyze in terms of the future state of the system. And also given the transition and the timing, we want to make sure we have the opportunity to hear from as many folks as possible. And I'll just say, I think we got a lot of things right, and I'm sure there are other things we're going to learn through the process that will strengthen these regulations and make them even better as we go forward. So I've asked Rob and Joy to give you sort of a reminder of what we're trying to accomplish, what's in those regulations, with a real focus on sort of the timeline of what will happen next, should you choose to take action on these today.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Welcome.
Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you.
And Secretary, thank you. And members of the board, nice to see you. Very excited for this culmination of all of the very hard work of an enormous team to bring to you today kind of a recap of sorts. When we were talking about the 8 months that have passed, I'm thinking in my head, here. Absolutely has been a strong effort, and we're very proud to talk to you today about this. So we started back in April to review previous regs and previous engagements, and we worked to have visioning sessions, and we engaged with all sorts of stakeholders, including subsidy administrators and programs and people who were actually impacted by these regulations and the policies and the procedures that are associated with them. We launched a pilot We assessed feedback from that pilot to inform iterative changes, and eventually used all of our stakeholder visioning and all of our interviewing and all of our research to inform a set of draft regulations for your consideration, which we brought to you last time. And so we're here today with the draft regulations ready for next steps. If we can move forward, please. Thank you. So we started way back with our guiding principles, and we've held true to these guiding principles ever since. We said we were going to be family-centered, and we have pursued that through every single thing we have done with content, with language, really trying to capture what it truly meant to be family-centered in what we said and what we did. We made a commitment to be accessible and equitable, same thing with our language and our content, and we believe that we have done that and continue to do that. Simplifying a naturally very complicated process has been both a challenge and also sort of a fun riddle to work through, and we continue to simplify processes and procedures, but really made a commitment to reducing the bureaucratic burden so that not only families are not facing bureaucratic burden, but that our our administrators are free to do the things that we really want them to do, which is support families, support providers, and work to support people who are navigating the system. We sought to be innovative, and we really thought outside the box, and we have big unicorn visions for what our technology system is going to look like. We worked hard and made a commitment to align our processes and procedures with other state agencies, with federal laws, with our own frameworks to make sure that there aren't, at the very least, there aren't competing standards within there, but to align to make it easier to navigate. And we have held to our commitment to be collaborative. We said on day one that we would engage and have a partnership with all stakeholders so that we could be sure that their voice and their needs were met, and we have done that, and we're very proud of that. So all of this in pursuit of what we hope will be some significant changes. So what we are hoping to see, what we intend to see, include an increase in the number of children and families that receive child care financial assistance, including our families who are navigating DCF and DTA, and families with infants and toddlers, families facing homelessness. We want to see an increase in the number of providers who are participating in the financial assistance system so we can build out some capacity. And we want to see a decrease in the number of families that are waiting on our wait list. Certainly a decrease in the time, but also in the number of families who are actually waiting. We want to see a decrease in the timeline between when a family applies and we're actually able to place a child in a program to be in care. And we want to see a decrease in the timeline for appeals decisions to be made. And we fully expect to meet these benchmarks and see these key metrics achieved in the work. And now I'm very proud to pass it over to Rob to talk through the areas of reform one more time.
Great. Thank you, Joy, and nice to see you all. Good afternoon. Thank you for having us again. I'm here as a representative of the legal department, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that a number of lawyers in our department have worked very hard on these regulations, some of whom are here today, some of whom are watching, so I just wanted to acknowledge them as well. It's been a big team effort. So just as some of this may be a reminder to some of you, but to kind of give a broad context about what we're trying to achieve and what we're seeking to do. So there are 41 total regulatory changes that were sent to you to review prior to this meeting. There are three main core areas that each regulatory change touches. Many of them touch multiple areas at one time. To increase overall system efficiency, to prioritize the family needs and experience, and to center families, and to modernize and update our system and create a framework by which we create the way for which we can then update the system for it. A lot of this is creating that framework, which will then go into policy and innovation and so forth. So in terms of the first bucket, if you will, to increase overall system efficiency, the main points that we're trying to do are to streamline and clarify roles and responsibilities. That's both on the EEC side, the subsidy administrator side, the parent side. Right now, there's a little bit of lack of clarity at times as to who is responsible for what and who should be providing what, and we are seeking to streamline that so everyone knows what their responsibilities are, and to remove some of the duplicative responsibilities that fall upon parents and families, which I'll talk about as we go. And I'll talk about right now. To reduce documentation burdens, there are many places in the regulations and frankly in the accompanying forms and policies which we're already thinking through, where a family has to report the same thing multiple times or the same thing to multiple people, and they're already dealing with a lot, and we're asking them a lot of information and asking them it again multiple times, and it can be very frustrating, and we've found in conversations with advocates in the field that we're often losing folks that decide to not even apply, and that there's a lost opportunity there, and we want to prevent that as much as we can. And then to use more inclusive and accessible language, although there's 41 regulatory substantive changes, you'll have noticed there's a lot of textual changes as well, both in definitions and just words we're using and language we're using to update it to modern times, to update it to current thinking, to be more family friendly, more family focused, and to really make clear that we are here to assist families in seeking and receiving assistance, and that's what we're trying to do. And we feel it's incredibly important to have that in the actual regulatory language itself, in addition to the policies and the forward-facing materials. So the next tenet is to prioritize those family needs and experiences. I mean, we really want to create more sports for families. I mean, to be blunt. I mean, that's at its core what we're trying to do. That's at the beginning of the process with pre-application consultation, where creating space, and we'll be updating, essentially FAQs or one-pagers that has clear information. What do you need? What do you need to send in? How long will it take? Who will you be talking to? Things of that nature. So we just have that clarity for families so they know kind of what they need and what's asked of them. Similarly, to alleviate those burdens, I already mentioned the duplicative nature of a lot of the verification system and a lot of the documents, but that's something, again, that these all touch kind of multiple areas, and that's one that we've sought time and time again in terms of what we were looking at. To extend certain timelines to ensure stability of care for children and families, in particular for those in priority populations, such as coming out of DCF referrals or DTA referrals. We are expanding, one specific thing we're doing is seeking to expand the post-transitional period. So if you're transitioning out of one of those referral programs, you are still supported along the way. And in that post-transitional period, we're actually seeking to double the time, again, just to provide further supports for those families to really get back into what they need to do. And then lastly, just reducing the rigidity and increasing flexibility for families. We obviously have to always be in mind of the federal CCDF obligations, and we're operating within that. But we took a very, very line-by-line look at those federal regulations and requirements to ensure that we are complying, but that we're providing as much flexibility as a Commonwealth and as an agency as we can within those rules to make it as simple as we can for families going through this system. And last, but certainly not least, is to modernize and update our system. One thing we've really been working on, both internally and even talking to external or I guess not external, but fellow Commonwealth agencies and departments, has been to just align ourselves much better across regulatory frameworks with our partner agencies and policies. We obviously are interacting, and our families are interacting with a lot of different, Commonwealth departments and agencies at once. And so getting back to trying to eliminate those duplicative processes, but also just ensuring that what we're seeking is what they're seeking, the information they're providing to them is also information we're getting. Right now, there's a lot of overlap at times, and frankly, there's some things that don't align, and we're seeking to correct that. To strengthen our partnerships with child care involved agencies, to do as much as we can to work with our providers, work with our subsidy administrators to make this just an efficient process for families, but also for them. I mean, we want to be clear that we're trying to assist across the board here as well, and be there for our administrators and providers. And last, there were a number of COVID flexibilities that were put in place at the beginning and the height of the pandemic. Some of those we reevaluated and looked at each one of them as to whether they should be retained, extended, changed, and you'll see that reflected in the regulations as well. And we think we've found a good, comfortable place for all of those. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joy just to kind of walk us through the next steps.
Great, thank you, Rob. So here we are. Next steps are a good amount of work. So we are presenting our final draft regulation changes to you today. And then we will begin our public comment period, which will commence tomorrow. We will, in the meantime, we are working very hard to finalize our policies and our procedures. That's really the lion's share of the work that we have up ahead right now, is to focus on, we know now the direction that we're going in, now how are we going to do it, and how can we make sure that we are integrating all of these changes seamlessly and in a way that is going to actually do what we intend for it to do. We anticipate deployment of the new policies and procedures accompanied with scaffolding materials like trainings and guidance materials in the May-June area, with an effective date for promulgation by July 1st of 2023 is what we're hoping for. And I will pass it back to you, Commissioner, with that.
Thank you both very much, and and to the rest of the team. So we would open it up for comments, questions from board members.
Nikki?
This is great. Thank you so much for the overview. And I appreciate the slide that had the metrics on it. And I just wanted to verify, we have baseline metrics for each of those measures, correct?
We sort of have baseline measures for each of those.
That's why I asked.
We
We
continue to
have the
work.
ones on the left.
Okay.
For sure. So the things we're aiming to increase, we do
Yep.
know who's being served by
Yes.
age group and program type.
But like some of the timeline questions?
Some of the timeline questions is, our system is fairly devolved.
Yeah.
And so some of this is still being collected in terms of really establishing a baseline. And it may actually vary depending on which part of the state that you live in
Yeah.
currently right now.
Yeah.
So we certainly know timeline for appeals decisions because those are done by the
Yeah,
agency.
that's right.
But part of, we've reported before to the board on a pilot that we've been working on in Western Mass with Seven Hills. Thank you to them for their work on that pilot. And part of that has been trying to figure out how to establish sort of the beginning, how we would measure the beginning of a timeline
Yeah.
and moving through the process. But
Okay.
we know it's longer than we want right now, so
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
felt comfortable putting it on as an area for decrease, even though we don't have a perfect measure of it right now.
Yeah. And I was just wondering, in terms of a timeline for review, like what would be, sort of when will you be checking in on those goals to say, okay, how are we doing against, these metrics that we set?
We track caseload on a weekly basis, and we'll be doing that on a monthly basis too. So we'll be able to report as often as the board would like on sort of where the caseload is, how that's going. I think we'll have to come back and report exactly, and we can report on the waiting list in terms of the families on there, but that data is not always as accurate as we hope, so that's something we're working on cleaning up as well. So those numbers we can report on a regular basis, and then the timelines in terms of when somebody's on the waiting list, how long it takes them to come off the waiting list, and also when somebody becomes eligible and the time it takes for them from the moment of eligibility into enrollment. We'll have to be reporting on those kind of as we go.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if we, like as part of the timeline for moving forward, should consider putting in place a formal sort of assessment of how it's going, so we could say, did the changes that we implemented do what we thought they were going to do? If not, why not? If so, then, what are the next steps, is what I'm
Absolutely.
sort of thinking.
I think we'd be happy to do that. So if we go for a July 1st implementation date, I think we'd be able to report quarterly back to the board on progress. So
Great.
at least report back in September after we implement in July. See if we're trending in the right direction.
Great, thanks.
Quarterly reporting is.
I like that idea. I think just to build on where Nikki's going, and to the sort of your end of year reflections, and we're getting through the door, and this is such substantial work for us to get through another door.
front
It would
door.
be interesting in 2023 to just think about, like, what is the operational dashboard, that 10 minutes each board meeting, whatever measures you have, but for the top 6 things, the top 8 things, we can spend 10 minutes on, not spend the whole meeting on.
Across areas.
Just that we get into a rhythm of like just what are the right operational measures we should just be watching together and asking you what you're learning from. And then, yeah. What do you think, Nikki? Do you like that? I mean, that's something like, there's a quarterly progress on this initiative, but there will be other measures too.
License capacity, work, eventually we're looking forward to having data on the workforce. We have some of it through C3
Yeah.
in a way we haven't had before. So I think key operational measures to touch down at every start of a board meeting is a great idea and something we can work towards.
I think this this is one of the most impactful changes that the department has suggested or proposed, at least in my time with, working within the field. I work at that level of enrollment, intake, and eligibility. I mean, I actually did work face-to-face with parents with regards to eligibility for subsidies, and the differences we'll make with regards to efficiencies for the workforce all the way through a child accessing the system are significant. And I sure hope that the field and all the providers in the field take advantage of this opportunity with regards to providing feedback so that we can, because no question there will be some tweaks that are needed that we're not thinking about, and I look forward to, and I would invite anybody to talk to me about it, because I dig this. I really love this. So I look forward to discussing it with anybody in the field that would like to reach out and suggest anything about it.
I would just echo the same thing. Thank you for all the hard work that's gone into this. I think that making regulations more streamlined and more efficient and easier to understand is always incredibly helpful to those using them, and even, for parents that make it less technical and, bogged down. So with that, I'm ready to vote to move it forward.
Other comments before we go ahead, Secretary?
Just to echo what's been said about, first of all, thanking the department and the commissioner for doing this work and for getting it on our agenda this year before we get into the new year. I think it's going to be very helpful to make sure that we're maintaining the momentum and getting this done in a timely way. But it's also, I think, important to sort of think about this in the right context, which is, when you talk about changing regulations and improving efficiency, it all sounds very wonky and bureaucratic and, all good. But it's easy to lose sight of what I think the long-term impact of this can and should be over time, which is that it's a first step in sort of making a turn in parent engagement. So it's not so much about, paperwork and eligibility determinations and investigations, if you will, and enforcement or things like that, but it's more about flexible and effective support for them and their families. And I think that's going to have a big impact on the way in which not only the department, but also the CCR&Rs and the programs and providers out in the field interact with parents so that the relationship isn't tainted in some ways or made less supportive than it should be, because there's all this focus on getting, checking all the right boxes and getting all the right pieces of paper. And, I think the big shift in this is writing rules that treat cases of families who are taking advantage of the system as exceptions to the rule, rather than sort of building the entire system to avoid, essentially any violations that may occur. And that, certainly gets people nervous, and may get some attorneys nervous around things like program integrity. But I think there's a general agreement here that families aren't trying to take advantage of the system. They're trying to work through the system, and it's just complicated. And sometimes that's hard to do, and sometimes it looks bad from the outside. But more often than not, it's just because they're overwhelmed and they have complicated lives, and it's hard to actually, pull all the pieces together in a timely way and stay current on all the reporting and filings that they may need to do. So anyway, all this is to say, I think this is tremendously important, not just in terms of making the system operate more efficiently, but making it better and more responsive for parents.
Well said.
Thank you for the positive tone, too, in the language. I mean,
Yeah.
there's not necessarily a change in
Right.
regulation, but it's just a completely different tone.
Excellent. Should we go ahead and vote? Great. I'll make the motion. This could be my last motion. Sorry, you won't enjoy my reading fluency after today. I make the motion that the Board of Early Education and Care approves the department's proposed amendments to 606 CMR Section 10 and authorizes the Commissioner of Early Education and Care to solicit public comment on the proposed amendments, subject to board approval of the final regulations. Could I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Maria. Allison Schoenwald,
Yes.
Jamela Lee,
Yes.
Maura Siegel,
Yes.
Paul Belcedo,
Yes.
Secretary Pizer,
Yes.
Carolyn Kane,
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz,
Yes.
Maria Mueller.
Yes.
So approved. Wonderful. Thank you
Thank you.
both, and
Thank
to
you.
everybody you represent.
Thank you, and I also want to thank the secretary, and I probably should have started by saying this was a priority for the secretary and the secretary's office for us to get it done by the end of the year, and without your support and pressure, that would not have happened, so thank you very much to you and your team for that. It was a truly a team effort across the secretariat.
Great.
All right, we will look forward to reporting back on public comment and what we hear. I'd like to invite up Jocelyn Bowen and Amy Checkaway and Adrian Murphy, who will dive into the latest survey findings. Oh, yeah, sorry. So as they are settling in, as you know, we have been running this program primarily with federal dollars to start. And the original intent of this program from the federal government was essentially to keep the field from free fall in the middle of the pandemic, and it indeed did that. And it also exposed what we know, that the early education and care field was already precariously balanced in terms of financing before the pandemic, and the pandemic has further and sort of permanently disrupted that. We are incredibly fortunate that we have state dollars to continue this program, where many other states are closing down their stabilization programs as the federal dollars dry up. And we've been incredibly fortunate in Massachusetts that we've had support through state funding to continue this program. And as we talked about in the beginning, we've also learned about what a central role it's playing in the stabilization and system building in the field. So the work the team has done to continue to gather this essential data from the programs who are participating, we're sharing sort of a preliminary set of findings today to help kind of illustrate its impact so far, and on each of the sort of key areas that we've been looking at in terms of program operations, staffing and compensation, and new this time around, looking a little bit at access and affordability, which I know has been a priority for the board as well. And we will continue to be digging into the findings as they come, but we wanted to bring what the sort of preliminary set of findings to help inform our thinking about what role a program like C3, or C3 itself, we hope, will play in the continued building of the early education and care sector. So like that, and it's a lot of data, so we'll apologize in advance, but it's really exciting, and we couldn't take anything out, so.
I'll just, this is unscripted, start by saying that I was at a convening recently, and a commissioner from another state came up to me and said, how have you managed to collect such comprehensive data? We could never do that in my state. So apparently we're starting to get a reputation about how much data we collect that is hopefully useful. So just share that.
Thank you. So very quickly, to give a roadmap to the presentation, we're going to start by setting the context, just reviewing what we know about the current child care market and program financing, which is the context within which C3 is working. Review the survey findings from the fall, the overall impact, the spending, and then also the ways in which investments have supported workforce as well as family access and enrollment, and then look ahead and think about the rest of 23 as well as looking ahead to 24. Just to highlight some key takeaways before we dig into the details, we know through the market rate and preliminary cost analysis that there is a persistent gap for most programs between the revenue and the cost of their programs, and that C3, from our survey report, has played a critical role in addressing this gap and allowing programs to invest in operational supports, as well as supporting increased compensation and benefits for educators. We've also heard from programs that the C3 funds have helped them stabilize capacity, as well as avoid tuition increases. But we still see staffing shortages that limit expanded capacity. The formula, particularly the equity adjustment, has been effective at targeting resources
to both support the staffing that programs are maintaining, as well as programs serving EEC subsidized families and those operating in communities with high social vulnerability indexes. And the other thing that we're learning, and I think this goes to Amy's point, is that we're really building a relationship with a much broader range of programs than we've had historically, and have been developing the ability to collect data more broadly than we have in the past, and then think about how to use that data to inform our ongoing design and development of this grant and our overall thinking about program financing. So digging into the childcare market, I don't think this is surprising to anybody. In a functioning market, obviously, revenues would ideally be greater than costs. Certainly, they would be balanced. Programs would have the opportunity to collect reasonable reserves and have opportunities for reinvestment. In the current market, we recognize that childcare revenue largely comes from tuition from families, and there really is a ceiling on how much programs can charge families. If increased too much, programs are threatening family affordability, and frankly, the calculus within the family finances leads families to withdraw from the market if the tuition is too high.
And withdraw from the job market.
Yes, and the job market. So the grants were designed to replace and sort of bolster the revenues and hopefully fill in that gap between costs and revenues for programs. Originally, that was focused on concern about the enrollment fluctuations that programs were facing early in the pandemic. What we hear right now from grantees is that these continue to be supportive in balancing the costs that programs are facing in trying to obtain workforce retention without jeopardizing affordability for families. And digging in just a little bit more deeply into that primary pain point, we're currently hearing that the market pressures around the workforce are really pushing for increased compensation so that programs can retain and hire qualified staff. And so the funding and the math of balancing a program's budget just puts increased pressure on that tension around balancing costs and revenues. Turn it over to Adrienne to now dig into the details of some of the things that we were finding and hearing from programs around their use of these funds.
Great, thanks, Jocelyn. I'm going to dig into the data from our fall survey of C3 recipients. But before I dig in, I want to note, I think as many others have said at various points today, that this was really a team effort. And I want to thank Ana Vasconcelos, who's the newest member of our growing data analytics team, as well as our partners at Third Sector, who really helped make the analysis of the massive amount of data we're going to bring to you today possible. So as I think you likely already know, this is the third of a series of surveys that we've provided to the field throughout each spring and fall throughout the C3 process. We launched this particular survey at the very end of September, and providers are required to respond to the survey before they certify their next month's grant payment, which allowed us to get a high response rate from the field. By the time we pulled the survey for this analysis, at the beginning of November, we had a response from just over 6,000 providers, which is 78% of our providers in Massachusetts, including 73% of group and school age providers, 81% of family child care providers, 87% of providers that serve children with subsidies. And then we also looked across the state and had a higher than 75% response rate across all of the regions.
Sorry, This is just a small point. So it's 78% of all providers in the state?
It's all providers in the state. Yep, all
amazing.
C3 eligible providers.
That's
So
amazing.
all providers that are.
So not just all, not just the recipients of the
Yeah.
grant, but all. That's
All,
amazing.
yep.
Sorry,
I mean,
all
that's-
C3 eligible
All
providers?
C3, all
Which is
providers,
all-
which is all
Oh,
providers.
Okay, I was like, did you, okay.
Yep, all licensed and funded providers. Yep.
Really great. It's like
Yeah.
as big a data set as you could possibly imagine.
Yep, yep. And I'll say we did the breakdowns here regionally and are reporting on that as those differences were notable, but also happy to answer questions about how other data broke down by region that we don't show here. So I'm going to start with some of the series of questions that we asked about the overall impact of C3. And we added an additional question this time around to ask providers about what C3 has allowed them to do to really get at the overall impact of C3 on programs. We saw that the number one response across both, but over 83% of group and school age providers and over 40% of family child care providers said that the grant allowed them to increase salaries for existing staff, which was the top response for group and school age providers. And providers, both across group and school age and family child care, said that the grant was able to allow them to continue to serve their desired number of children, to hire additional staff, to provide new or increased benefits, and to invest in their physical space. And I think of important note, 2/3 of family child care providers and about half of group and school age providers reported that most fundamentally the grant allowed them to remain open during the grant period, which I think again emphasizes what we'll see in just a moment, the sort of reliance of many programs on these grants to maintain their program operations and to remain stable. On the flip side of that coin, we also asked, just as we did in the spring, about what changes providers would likely have to make if C3 funds were no longer available. The top response for among group and school age providers is that they would have to either defer planned salary or benefit increases if grant funding were no longer available. And both group and school age and family child care providers also reported that if grant funds were no longer available, they were likely to increase tuition rates, reduce discretionary expenses, and reduce compensation, including, in the case of family child care providers, their or their assistants' compensation. And I think I want to draw attention to that, the second to last set of bars, that 9% of all group and school age providers and 14% of FCC providers, which amounts to just over 750 programs statewide, reported that they were likely to have to close without continued C3 funding. And I'll dig in just a second into sort of who those programs are.
How many kids does that represent, Adrian?
That's a great question, Commissioner. So across those seven, yeah.
So when the other one, it's, I guess, fourth from the bottom, reducing staffing levels, presumably that would mean reducing their license capacity or their enrollment. So
Yeah.
there's the full closures, but then there's,
Yeah.
essentially what amounts to partial closure.
Yeah, or closing
Or ratios in
classrooms.
classrooms.
Yeah.
We've heard from a lot of programs that coming out of COVID, a lot of behavioral and language delays and need for additional bodies and skills and teachers in the classrooms to support that. So it could also be reducing levels of staffing in classrooms too.
So a little bit, sort of digging in a little bit further to the 751 providers that reported that they would have to close if C3 funding were no longer available. Those providers have the capacity to serve just over 15,000 children. And 74% of those providers are family child care providers, which, as we saw in the last slide, family child care providers are more likely than group and school age providers to report that they would have to close without continued C3 funding. About 38% of the providers that reported they would have to close are in the highest SVI communities, and about 65% serve children with subsidies, 35% do not. Those last three numbers are about proportional to the provider population as a whole. It's really that 74% that are family child care providers that is disproportionate to the provider population as a whole. So this next set of graphs allow us to, or the next set of analyses allow us to dig in and better understand how providers are using their grant funds, which will be the focus of the next bit of conversation. I think you've seen this graph before for previous surveys, but this pie chart here outlines the distribution of C3 grant spending across spending categories. As you'll see, about 60% of all grant funds are sort of in these blue-hued categories, which represent the operational spending categories. That includes existing payroll and benefits, past costs, and other operational expenses, which is largely rent, mortgage, utilities, and insurance, the sort of expenses that go to keeping the lights on. The spending in this category represents 60% of all grant funds, which is down a little bit from 66% at this time last year. So providers are spending, while it's still the bulk of spending slightly less in the operational spending categories now compared to a year ago. And shifting some of that into these sort of red-hued investment categories. So these include investments in salary and benefit increases, bonuses, and other types of new investments, which ranges from curricula and materials to staff professional development, mental health supports for children and staff, et cetera. These categories jointly are up to 24% of all grants funding, which is up from 20% at this time last year. So while providers are still spending the bulk of dollars in the operational categories, there is a shift over time from the operational categories into these investment categories.
Can I do one data
Yeah.
question? So 83% of group and school age providers have increased salaries for existing staff, and 41, back at the other previous slide, right? And then, but only 10% of total dollars spent
Yeah.
represent those increases?
Yeah, part of the reason we wanted to ask this question about what it's allowed them to do is because it could be that spending in a particular area opens up other dollars to be invested in, for example, so it may be that 83% have not increased salaries with C3 dollars themselves, but being
I
able
see.
to put C3 towards.
Allowed them to then go with other.
Correct.
Maybe less stable. Okay.
Yeah.
Offset, yep.
Yeah, and also I think it's sort of the percentages represent two different things. We were chewing
Yeah,
on this a little
yeah.
bit too, and 83% of programs versus 10% of the
Of the
money.
dollars
So
spent,
it's
yeah.
also,
That's
there's
what
sort
I
of a
was-
question and postman in there in terms of like what would be the percentage we would want to see that
That's
went
what
into
I'm
salary
wondering.
increases as well?
Yeah. Do we have an answer for that?
Well, I think it's also just important
That's a
to
big question.
remember, like, if we go back to first principles, this wasn't designed as a workforce strategy or support. It was designed as an operational support infrastructure building in the middle of a crisis, albeit using a very strategic approach that imagines a stronger mixed delivery system. And the field is rational, right? They're not necessarily going to spend a whole lot on workforce that may create cliffs on a one time. But I think the critical thing is having pored over these data, like there's some very important learnings that would feed into workforce development strategies and approaches. So it turns out to be this kind of window into the field, right? When you apply something universally to a fragile field, like how does it get taken up? And what do we learn about other channels that would be more dedicated, in this case, to the workforce? But I don't know that we'd expect a very different picture at the workforce level for all kinds of obvious reasons about the magnitude of the investment and the timing.
Given the uncertainty of it.
That's right. I mean,
Yeah,
this
that's
is,
the
I think
problem
this
with
is the
this
rub.
beautiful
and-
thing.
Right. But it also was designed as, in terms of bolstering operating infrastructure writ large, right?
And just a quick question. You talk about operational spending being 60%, but when I look at the categories, so there's existing payroll and benefits, there's operational expenses. I would include bonuses and salary and benefit increases under operational costs. When you add all that together, it looks like it's over 70%. But it seems higher, unless I'm sort of
Yeah.
mischaracterizing those categories.
I think the distinction for this was sort of trying to think about costs that already existed before programs decided to, potentially increase compensation, which is sort of above and beyond what they might have been able to do. But agreed that once those investments are made, they sort of become part
Yeah.
of the operational picture, so.
Okay. And again, to the point about, and this gets to the policy point, the extent to which this is still seen as a temporary program, it makes it hard to, make those long-term choices to bake something into your operating budget.
And I think we'll see that too in the next few slides, which break down the spending by family childcare providers versus group and school age providers. We'll see that play out. So this chart looks at the amount that the average family childcare provider and group and school age provider are spending by category. And we can see that group and school age providers still continue to spend the largest share of C3 funds on existing payroll and benefits at 41%, while FCC programs continue to spend the largest share of their funds on operational expenses. That 39% includes rent, mortgage, utilities, and supplies. And of that 39%, 30% on average is rent and mortgage, with 4% being facilities, maintenance, 3% PPE, and the 3% everything else. Yep, Karen.
Hi, so, for the family childcare providers, right, but they would have rent, mortgage, utilities, regardless of whether they were at FCC or not, right? I'm just looking at, so what is the cost? They're running them out of their homes, right? So I just look at the cost for actually running the business versus the cost of, having a living location. And then that, I guess, begs the question, most people, are they in their current residence, or do they expand their residence to be able to accommodate this type of, just because I don't see it, like if I decided to do childcare out of my home, my expenses are still gonna be there. They might go up a little bit, especially on the utilities, but those other pieces would be my costs monthly anyway. That's all.
Yeah. You'll have the same question when we get to the salaries
Yeah.
too, because the salaries for family childcare are extremely low, yet how much is going into rent and other things that others of us who are not running businesses out of our homes might be using to pay for some of those things. So the financing model around family childcare is different and more complicated as we understand their sort of compensation and financing in that setting, right? Yeah.
And there are multiple different models with, the separate space that's an expansion to hold the program versus in your living room.
I will add that we looked at this breakdown by providers SVI, as well as the percent of children served that are receiving EEC subsidies. And we didn't see enormous differences, I think, which suggests that providers across the board are using some of these funds to support operational expenses. The only really meaningful difference we did see is that when we looked at school programs that serve just school-age children, we saw an even larger percentage of funds being spent in that existing payroll and benefits, even relative to other group and school-age programs. And then we also looked at what this looks like over time. We saw that you can see that the other operational expenses decreased both for group and school age and family child care programs, with the amount spent on salary and benefits increasing over time, both in the group and school age and family child care sort of sides of the coin. And I think this sort of gets back, Secretary, to your comment about how much we would expect to see that grow, and whether or not some of the growth, but slow growth there, is because of the sort of temporary or uncertainty around the long-term nature of the grant funding. We did ask some questions in this survey to get a little bit also at the unspent funds. We asked providers who have more than a quarter of their grant funds still left to spend, which was about a third of programs overall, about their plans for those dollars. Most programs, about 36% of group and school age programs and half of FCCs, said that they were setting aside program reserves for the future, which I think is also a testament to some of the uncertainty around the duration of the grants. And then also followed by a large proportion of programs that said that they were saving up for large facilities or building-related expenditures. So sort of larger one-time expenditures there. And then last but not least, we also asked this time providers what they would prioritize if grant funding were extended that they are currently not, that they have not yet prioritized. And interestingly, both group and school age programs and family child care providers reported that they would invest in educators, from increasing educator salaries and benefits to professional learning opportunities, which I think is clear evidence that providers are eager to invest with these dollars in educators and in the workforce with ongoing grant funds. I'm going to turn this over to Amy.
Great. So I am going to next focus on program capacity and some updated data on staffing and turnover, as well as compensation. And as was already mentioned, this data really provides a unique snapshot into the workforce and the status of the field right now. And I think the more we tried to obviously limit the number of questions we asked, but some of this will prompt questions about things that we wish we knew more about that we might be able to dig into the future. So first of all, we asked group and school age programs just about their ability to serve their full capacity, which is a question that we have asked over time through C3. And you can see that about 1/3 of programs reported that they are unable to serve their full capacity, which has increased since the spring, from 28% to about 35%. I will note we didn't test these differences for statistical significance, but I think we tried to only highlight differences that seemed to be meaningful. So if these programs were fully staffed, we totaled the number of children that they could serve that they currently are not, and it was between 10 and 15,000 children. They reported in a range, which is why there's a range there. So not surprising to many of you, programs continue to report real staffing shortages, and more than half of them report they're currently hiring for at least one open educator position. Among these programs, the average program is hiring for about between 3 and 4 new or unfilled positions. And you can also see that educator turnover is slightly higher in programs that are serving kids with subsidies versus more kids with subsidies versus those with fewer or none at all. And turnover is also appears to be slightly lower in the western part of the state compared to other regions. The survey data also really gives us insight into the current number of positions that are open statewide. Again, because we have such a good response rate, these totals are likely meaningful. And so in total, across all of the respondents, programs reported over 2,000 open educator positions and over 4,000 open positions across roles statewide. So we estimate that this means that about 10% of staffing or staff positions are currently unfilled, and that open teacher roles are making up the majority of those openings. And again, as was already mentioned, this clearly also limits programs' ability to serve full capacity. We also wanted to use this survey as an opportunity to gather more information about turnover and retention. Obviously, it's a complicated issue to really get comprehensive data on, but we were able to ask programs about turnover in their positions over the past year, and overall programs report that almost 1/3 of educator positions have turned over, which is a high rate. And we found this is fairly consistent across regions, and there is higher reported turnover in programs serving more kids with subsidized kids, which is consistent with other research as well.
Can we just acknowledge how bad that is?
And how
So bad.
expensive it is?
That a third of educator positions have turned over in the past year? I mean, that's got to be through the roof bad. Okay, sorry, I just thought
Yeah, and we know from research how important stable, consistent relationships are, as well as just inefficiencies that creates for programs. So.
Yeah, do we have a benchmark for sort of, I mean, the Great Resignation, everybody quit and everything. So do we have like a benchmark for kind of community versus, this sector in particular? I heard you ask about K to 12, I think. Yeah, just like to highlight how bad it is, because I think you're absolutely right. It's awful and, really bad for the kids involved and, yeah. But yeah, just knowing some kind of like benchmark would be helpful.
That makes sense.
Can you just go to the slide before?
Of course.
The slide before. What is the difference between the middle and the right? The first is statewide. The middle one is.
The middle is of those 3,900 and, I can't read from here, educator positions, what's the breakdown of those by rule? So half of the open educator positions statewide are teacher positions, but then of the teacher positions, about 12% are open.
Okay. So we also asked programs what the most common reasons are for staff turnover. And the most frequent responses were that staff are leaving the sector altogether, with the second most common reason being that staff are leaving for positions in the public schools. I'll also point out about 20% of programs reported staff who have decided to stay at home or not work at all. And there were a variety of sort of other responses here, which ranged from, having kids, starting a family, starting a new business, seasonal workers, work being stressful, which probably is something a lot of folks are feeling. But we might dig more into some of those other responses once we have more time.
Sorry.
Yep.
Educator in this, is that the equivalent of the total survey or the pool of teachers and assistant teachers that's being broken down after?
Yeah, so I believe the question was the most common reason for staff turnover generally.
Yeah,
We didn't break it down by role.
Okay, so it could be all these roles.
Correct.
Yeah.
It would be
Okay.
across everyone.
And providers could choose, I think it's in the slide, choose up to the three most that they felt were the reasons why they were losing staff educators the most.
So just calling out, this is at the provider level. So
Yes.
it's percentages of providers seeing this, not percentages of educators
Correct.
reporting this.
It's not at the educator level. So programs continue to report a variety of strategies to both recruit and retain staff, with the most common strategy being trying to offer more competitive salaries and benefits. Third sector also conducted some recent focus groups of C3 programs, and I just wanted to highlight that, consistent with some prior discussion today, programs did report that they would like to use more of their funds for staff compensation, but they were reluctant because of the uncertainty about the future of these funds. But in many cases, they had to raise salaries simply to keep staff and avoid even higher turnover. So one-time payments obviously is one way of dealing with uncertainty in terms of a strategy that was frequently reported, and also providing additional flexibility to staff in a variety of ways. So as I mentioned, almost all group and school-age programs did report providing some kind of salary increase, not necessarily just with C3 funds, but also potentially using funds from other sources as well. And just under 2/3 used funds to increase salaries, and just over 2/3 used C3 funds to increase salaries, and to all educators. That I think that's what I'm trying to say. So we asked if they targeted their salary increases to all staff, or they sort of distinguished between only providing increases for staff in different roles, or staff who had been there longer, and most of them reported at least providing sort of a universal increase. But if they did target, the most common way to sort of target the funds was to try to increase compensation for teachers, sort of lead teachers in the classroom. Hope that made sense. So we continue to also collect data about compensation, and you'll see here that hourly pay across different roles. So this is a comparison between July 2021 and this past fall in October. So hourly pay continues to increase over time. We collected from each program the highest and the lowest hourly pay by role, and then the midpoint is simply the midpoint of the highest and the lowest rate reported. So overall, average compensation obviously remains low compared to most other sectors, although relatively there are some meaningful increases. I'll point out the statewide midpoint of educator pay equates to a FTE annual salary of about $42,000 per year for an educator, which is below 50% of SMI for a single parent family of two, which is currently just over $46,000. We looked at this also by region, and we are seeing some variation in hourly pay across regions, with higher salaries in the Northeast and Metro Boston, which likely reflects higher cost of living and more competition from other sectors. And finally, we looked at differences between programs serving more subsidized kids and programs serving less, and find that educator compensation is somewhat lower in programs that serve more subsidized children. And again, I do believe this is consistent with other research in the literature. And finally, we asked family childcare providers about their annual take-home pay after expenses or losses. And you can see here that about 16% of providers are reporting no take-home pay at all or losses, and that over half of providers are reporting less than $30,000. Only 10% are reporting making more than $46,000 per year. So fairly sobering data. As was already mentioned, there may also be investments in other aspects of their business or sort of cost of living that are not reflected here. Family childcare providers also report working long hours. We thought this was important to try to learn more about as well. And so when you start to calculate out how much an hourly rate may be here, they report spending between 41 and 50 hours per week with kids, and almost half of them report an additional 6 to 10 hours per week on other tasks.
This is different than what we've seen before,
Is it?
right? I mean, I always, the sort of like understanding that I had was that like operating an FCC, you had a higher sort of take-home pay than you would if you were working as a teacher in a group and school age program.
Yeah,
That was sort of my like folk understanding that was from somewhere. I don't know.
It's interesting, we were talking about how we're not sure there has ever been sort of this kind of systematic data collection on family child care providers from the whole sort of universe of programs. But I don't have a
'Cause this is
comparison
awful.
in my mind. It is truly sobering.
I mean,
We are saying after subtracting all bills and expenses.
Right.
So there's
That's true. I mean, so if they're
even
mortgage,
saying it's,
right?
so they're earning between, maybe it's, yeah.
I'm
So I
sorry,
think it's complicated.
Yeah.
This is after you've paid your mortgage and,
Correct. After expenses.
right, after expenses.
And is this assuming full enrollment?
This is just sort of their current annual reported take-home pay, so.
I mean, to be clear, it's not, like, we didn't give them specific and detailed guidance, like one might have on your tax forms about how to calculate this out. So it's their sense of what they're taking home after they take in their tuition revenues, pay out the expenses associated with their business.
Which is different than how we would report, that if you're not running a business out of your home, how you might report your annual take-home. Will the cost work, that's this next phase of the cost work, look a little bit more at sort of the cost structures in family childcare to give us kind of a not counter, but like an additional set of insights into how their finances are structured?
Yes.
Yeah, that would be great to see, because I'm looking at like, this is like, why does anyone run an FCC then? Like, that's awful,
Not to make money.
but yeah,
Yeah.
no, yeah.
Well,
that's-
and we do hear that from
Yeah.
FCC. I mean, not quite so specifically, but there are a lot of reasons that people talk about why they do the work that they do that are not related to the income that they draw from their business.
Something else which came out from the recent focus groups were that family child care providers in particular, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, were very reluctant and had really tried not to raise family tuition for the past while, which may be reflected in some of this as well. So really worrying about the families they're serving and their financial needs and trying to help them stay in care.
I'm just thinking about the differential rates that we pay for the subsidized slots, and like, is that fair in that case? I mean, if that's the reality, then it makes me think that maybe we should be paying the FCCs more.
So that's why I think that it'll be so interesting to see this data comparative to what we learned from the cost data too, because I think I think we've often put a center-based lens onto our family child care, and it's such a different model for delivering services and for self-employment and running your own. Really want to be thinking about them as running their own businesses, right? And what does that look like to do that? And so maybe if they were thinking about as business income instead of as take-home pay, which is sort of how we think about it in the center-based.
Right.
We still want them to be
Yeah, what is your business
able
revenue
to
look
survive,
like? Yeah.
doing the business they're doing, but maybe
Yeah.
it's a different, maybe we ask a different set of questions after we've seen how the cost data works.
How different, well, I understand that when you looked at the other set, from the other providers, right, there was like one person over 78, and, can you go back to that one?
The spread of,
Yeah. No. One more. I don't know where it was. It's been a lot of numbers.
sorry, yes.
You can't, it's comparing apples and oranges, right?
Right.
Because, right,
Yeah.
but I
that's
think
true.
it's,
Yeah,
but it, I think it's comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah.
No one's going into any of these fields to make a lot of money, right? So I think the question is economic mobility, that none of this is going to allow for a lot of economic mobility. There's some economic, perhaps, security, should we not have another pandemic tomorrow, which hopefully we won't. And then the other benefits, right, to doing this. But either way, I mean, no one's making enough money for what they deserve, for sure. But I feel like that might be a jump to say, well, does that mean the family daycare providers need to make more money in subsidies without actually trying to compare apples to apples? Just,
Because of the operating expenses. I mean, in some ways, how you handle the notion of the operating
right.
expenses.
Can you
and
deduct your
kiosks is
car
gonna just
because you
depend-
do pick up and
it's gonna
drop off and you
change
buy the
you
food? Do you buy all your family food? And
Right.
I'm not saying anyone's lying, and no
Right.
one is making enough money, that's not a question.
Right.
But if I have a home office, how many things can I deduct that I can't deduct with my office that's not in my, so my take rate, it's just a totally different calculation, which isn't, if you want to save money to put your kids through college, this is not enough. Right, I'm not arguing that, I'm just like, I think that feels like a little bit of a jump.
So maybe as we think about both future surveys and also the cost work, I think we have to change our thinking, in the center-based setting, we're like, how much are you making an hour, and is it going up? And that makes sense, and how does that translate into an annual amount, and what kind of compensation package do you have otherwise? On the family child care provider side, it's like, how are your expenses being covered, and are you clearing enough to reinvest in your business, or invest in new things, or the program itself, and are you paying yourself a salary above those expenses so I think we need to ask the questions a little bit differently to
And
understand.
making sure they
Yeah.
understand the question being asked too, because, it could be at the end of the day, they're running their business and they're doing it successfully, but they're looking to say, well, I don't really have much left over after all that's done, but is that the real question, or is it, you know what I mean? So.
Right, salary's not
no,
the right, it's like not a great question, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm really interested to sort of dive into the costs
Yeah.
and look at,
Revenue
look at it
over
from a cost
expenses.
You
perspective.
should just look at it plainly and say, well, if you're not making any money, why would you bother to do it, right? I mean.
Right.
just-
But if you could pay your mortgage, then
Right.
maybe that's why.
Right, and you love it, right?
and
Yeah,
also
I mean,
get home to
although
kids, too, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's kind
A
of-
significant number of programs, family childcare, are also at least stating that they may be on the verge of closing because of sort of financial instability, so I think keeping
What-
that in mind as well.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the other ways we're going to learn more about how to support family childcare and their sort of financial model is through Maria mentioned that one of the things we'll be focusing on in the workforce group is really kind of a capacity strategy in family childcare, which is going to focus on sort of recruiting new providers into the field and then supporting them through licensure and through their early kind of operational days. And there will be business supports as sort of part of that strategy. And so that may also give us kind of insights into how do they structure their budgets and what's in and what's out and how do they compensate themselves, which is an interesting question.
Yeah, I think that's one piece that we might get out of the cost work that would be really helpful is, sort of where are the strong models? Because we ought to see the range in that data and that's, I think, what we often hear anecdotally, that there are providers that have structured their business to be a sound business and to also support their ability to provide the service to families that they want. And that the more we can understand those models and support people and others in understanding it, I don't think many people initially go into family childcare because they feel like they've got a great business model. They're being drawn to it to serve children and serve families, and they're learning as they go how to run a business.
We better keep marching on. We have two more sections, but this one's short. They're both shorter.
Yes, so we just wanted to share a few new data points related to family access and also enrollment. So we asked programs if they currently have a wait list for family enrollment, and almost half of programs overall reported that they do. With this actually being more common among group and school age providers with lower subsidy enrollment that are situated in geographic areas with lower SVI scores. We found some variation by region here with the Southeast and Western Massachusetts programs more frequently reporting having a wait list. And for programs that did have a wait list, the group and school age programs on average reported that it was 43 children long, and family childcare reporting an average of 9 children on their wait lists.
So this is not right either. No. Okay, I'm just, I mean, but to have this data, it's just, I mean, to have families with 43 children on, like 43 families.
It's like a whole turnover
9
of the
classrooms.
programs.
Yeah,
In
that
some
they,
cases.
that they, you know,
What are they doing?
what are they
Childcare.
doing? We
Well,
didn't
and
ask
I
the
think
follow-up
it's-
question, did we? I know we can.
Yeah, but no, and they may not know,
Yeah.
you know, and they may be staying out of the workforce, which is, has a whole nother cascading set of problems, or they may be, right, making choices that they wouldn't want to make because they have to go to work, so there's a lot of meaning in that waiting list
I
information.
think the other thing to call out on that is in our current model, without additional supports, a healthy program has a significant wait list that they can draw from as children leave, because you need full enrollment to survive without any additional supports. So that is the other dynamic that I think we need to keep in mind, is that without additional supports, you're creating a market that has built-in scarcity, because that's the only way as people come and go and move around programs for programs to maintain themselves and sustain enrollment and revenue.
But just to note that this is the program waitlist. This doesn't even take into account the subsidy waitlist.
Financial assistance help. No,
Right, which is a different waitlist.
Another
So if you're trying to do
15,000,
both.
20,000.
The good news is you have all this data to act on, right? The bad news is when other states see what the data shows, they're not going to try to collect more data. Because this data is probably a lot better than more than, I don't know, 3/4 of the states out there. I mean, right, it's not that it's okay, but relatively speaking, I mean, it is, I don't think this data is surprising at all. I think we've known this problem for years and years and years, but now we have to look at it. It doesn't mean it's okay. But I think it's better here than a lot of places.
But having data allows you to more effectively advocate for
Right.
additional funding
Right.
for these reasons.
And target our interventions, right? So as we're thinking about the high turnover rates and empty classrooms and people leaving for new industries, that's why we sort of have our sights on the recruitment and retention into the field right now, and what, whether it's childcare financial assistance or making it easier to hire. So the data also informs our intervention strategies in a, effective way.
Knowledge is power, right?
Yes, or burden. Power and burden.
I also think, in the spirit of the department too, collaboration is important in analyzing data, because working in the field, you're going to see scenarios that we don't all think about, and I think it's a good thing that we're highly collaborative at this point, because I think I could think of 2 or 3 scenarios like, well, what if, or well, yes, they're lower, but like there's additional things that play into this data that they're hard to know or to think of if you're not really in it every day.
Maria, I love that point. And is there any kind of plan to sort of share back with at least the C3 grantees to sort of say, this is what we saw, like to sort of have a reflection with folks to say, like, what does it mean to you? What surprises you about this data? Or, what is this data telling you? Or, just to have like some reflection.
Yeah, I mean, it looks to me that the C3 grants are what's was needed, right? And obviously not enough, but what was needed to prevent a lot of program closure. And, if that's coming to an end, there's going to be a cliff with regard to childcare daycare,
Okay, I'm sorry.
Sorry, what was the?
Sorry, can I ask one?
I definitely don't want to start hearing any conversation from the board.
So I just trying to do a little back of the envelope math, which is probably dangerous, but based on the wait list data that was up there before, it looks like there's probably something close to 65,000 to 70,000 children on wait lists in total. And that may or may not be good math, but if you assume, what are we assuming the total utilization is of the license capacity?
Currently, we think it's probably between 80 and 90% of full capacity.
So I'm just trying to put these two pieces together in terms of underutilized capacity and the size of the wait list.
The other piece, though, is those 43 children could be on many,
And they
parents could be
multiple.
putting,
Because
you don't want to
if-
put your eggs in one
If
basket.
they're at
right?
80%, if the license capacity is, what, 230,000, and there's 20% of the seats that are unutilized, that's 46,000.
Yeah.
That may actually not be too far off from what the unduplicated wait list is. Which kind of gets to this point about, A, the capacity is not always where the children are, and B, the matching process, and the efficiency with which the market operates. Anyway, sorry for that.
Yeah, I mean, my guess
sidelight.
would be a lot of the wait list is in infant care, right?
Well, yes,
I
that's
mean,
the other
that would be
thing,
my
right?
guess.
Is where,
Yeah,
yeah.
and then it might be that a lot of the spots are in the older,
Yep.
yeah.
Okay. We also asked about tuition increases, just to get a sense of how often and to what extent programs are increasing tuition. We don't have a baseline, so this is the first data point that I'm aware of. But about a third of programs reported raising tuition in the past year. Interestingly, across all programs, most of them reported not raising it very much, so probably to try to keep up with cost of living between 0 and 5%, which maybe even is less than inflation. And as I already pointed out, we do have some qualitative data that programs, and particularly family child care providers, are really trying to manage tuition rate increases and in many cases using C3 as a way to help manage the extent to which they have to increase tuition. And finally, we asked some questions about financial assistance beyond EEC subsidies, just to try to get a sense of the extent to which programs are providing additional financial assistance and which kind of programs, and found that about half of programs reported, or almost half, providing some kind of financial assistance to families beyond subsidies. And about 20% of programs provided reduced childcare tuition for staff. About 15% provided program-funded scholarships, and 11% offered sliding scale tuition. We found providers serving less subsidized kids in lower SVI areas were more likely to provide additional financial assistance beyond subsidies, perhaps because they had the resources in some cases to do so. And that ends my section, so I think I'm going to turn it back to...
Yeah, and I think given the time, I might whip through the next few slides.
Yeah, some of it.
Yeah, we're going to try and wrap in about 5.
Okay. So
We are not going to let C3 get in the way of a good party.
So just highlighting the timeline, that right now we're looking at extending out into FY23. We'll talk about the details of that in a minute. And a reminder of the formula, I won't go through it. I think most people are familiar with it. It is in the slides if you want to review and see. I'm just going to quickly.
Perfect.
Sorry, Adrian was going to do these, but I
Go
think
for
I
it.
can, just very, very quickly, I think we have a set of slides that show the ways in which the equity adjustment has been supporting, sending funding towards providers in different categories. So, the ways in which FCC providers have been benefiting from the equity adjustment, as well as those serving children with subsidies, and also the ways in which that's distributed across the regions, which I think there was some interest in understanding. I'd say that percent of C3 funding that's been allocated from the equity adjustment is the column to look at. Looking ahead to the rest of FY23, we did have in the economic development bill an additional $150 million allocated to C3, with a call out that not less than $60 million of this shall be made available as grants to providers serving subsidized children, with specifications about how that's calculated. So the way we plan to put out this funding is, you can see in the bar graph below, These are our sort of estimated expenditures across the year with a little bit of an assumption that they will go up on a monthly level as the year closes, as providers, catch up on their grant recertification. And that will take us through full payments to all C3 providers through April, with an additional payment in February to expend out the one-time $60 million expenditure to subsidize providers, and then closing out the funding we currently have available with the expenditures we can make in May.
Let me just summarize. We have been fortunate that we had $250 million for the C3 program included in the final FY23 budget. We estimated that would take us sort of through December under the current funding formula. And then the economic development bill included this additional $150 million, which we were thrilled to receive to be able to continue the program. There is this $60 million carve-out, leaving about $90 million for the actual C3 program, which, as Jocelyn said, will take us through, April and a half in terms of funding for the program. But there will be an additional $60 million that goes out to the subsidized providers per the line item language. We're aiming for February, but that may not be exactly when it gets out, we hope. We are committed, the agency is committed to being able to try and identify additional funds for FY23, and in the board's budget recommendations, you certainly included your commitment to FY24 funding for C3, and using the information that we've gathered here today to figure out how we continue to talk about the importance of these kind of investments, both to finish out this current year, but also think about funding into the coming years, we hope. So we have a couple slides that kind of wrap up our.
Sorry, can I just ask you a quick question about that previous slide? I know that we're trying to wrap up. Why give it out as an additional payment in February instead of extending it into May and June?
So those dollars, the $60 million, come with very specific line item language.
And so it has to.
Doesn't have to go out in February, but it has to go out on a per-child basis exclusively for providers that are serving subsidized families.
Oh, okay, so it couldn't go
it's
out
sort
to
of a
everybody.
separate.
Okay, gotcha,
it's in the
gotcha.
C3, sort of the funding in the economic development bill that was allocated for C3, but it's a separate set aside for just subsidized providers on a per-child basis. So that's how that funding will go out. And the $90 million that's included there will go out as part of the way we've been doing through the formula.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
I think just to close out, some design considerations and reflections that we're engaging in, looking back at the data and thinking ahead, sort of where C3 could go. Reviewing some of the basic structure of the formula, thinking about the eligibility criteria, I think we do hear that this is still something that is broadly needed to support operational expenses and to support programs' financial stability. So it does suggest that the broad-based eligibility has been and continues to be important for the C3 formula, or for the grant to serve its purpose. We are, as we've referenced, continuing to dig more deeply into the cost modeling, going beyond the preliminary work shown to you in the fall. And we will use that to look more closely at the ways in which the formula is apparently effectively or not effectively allocating funding to account for differentials in costs across serving different age children, different program types in different regions, and those serving families with subsidies. And then a few additional design considerations, looking at the ways in which we are, structuring the grant to support longer-term investments. We've talked about it already, but the concerns around the temporary nature of the funding, limiting without, just sort of saving up programs' ability to take on longer-term investments like salaries. Also looking at the ways in which we might strengthen the relationship between the funding and the family affordability access. It's created an important stabilization factor in the field, but I think we could look at that more closely and think about what else we might want to accomplish from the grant, and similarly looking at the ways in which we can use it as a workforce support. And then finally, continuing to do the work of developing the data and making sure we're collecting the data. And really, again, I think also it's important to say only the data that we need to inform our decisions. So trying to find that balance between collecting too much but also getting what we need to plan this effectively going forward.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm sorry we're squeezing you on time, and all of you, because I think you, like us, are interested in understanding how this program is operating. And as the chair said, as we dig in deeper, we understand it was designed for the sort of operational capacity support. Thank you, Jocelyn. And as we look forward,
how do we want to think about these kinds, if we have the fortune to have funding like this as well. Okay, that concludes the formal presentation.
Thank you. So much to dig into. Also flagging for sure a need to rally up more C3 dollars, given this is going to be news and difficult news, right, for the field about the shortfall in a way. So I had a cold a few weeks ago, and one thing that happens around this hour is I start to lose my voice as the final symptom, which I think has worked out well for a lot of people in my life, but it's not ideal for today. Let me just say a very few quick things to close this out officially. One is, I think sometimes I find it personally hard to mark time, but my time on this board, some of you know, started when our youngest was maybe 8 weeks old, and that Charlie is off to grade 2 and told me this morning that I had the schedule wrong. So that's one way to know it's been 7.5, close to 8 years. The second is that I didn't bring my glasses today, and I could hardly see that screen right there. So I do know that that amount of time has passed. Let me thank a few people. First, each and all of you and prior board members who made this such a tremendous experience and who brought the mission to the table every single day in very engaged ways. Today, you know, as you know, I have been working closely with Paul Belcito on this transition. I want to thank him for his friendship and his commitment to the board, also to the new and commissioner, not so new, but new, who just so ably stepped in and leaned in and stepped up at a moment that was really critical, and that shows today, particularly in the end of year review. Allison Schoenwald is here for her final meeting as well. Allison and I go way back, actually long before this board.
To this building.
Griping in formal ways about grade retention without a plan for those little readers. I am ever grateful to Allison for her collaboration and her commitment to this board. I think Allison effectively asks two questions most of the time in some way, shape, or form. How does this matter for children and families? And what about mental health? And through COVID, we especially leaned on Allison thinking hard about those issues. The secretary, I'm not sure we knew what we were headed into together a long time ago, but I have come to know the secretary as somebody, a policymaker who has a tremendously wide and deep knowledge base and who is so very committed to thinking up high, but getting in the weeds and the pragmatism down low. And that's been always so rare in my experience working with folks who care a lot about mission, who care a lot about improving education, who want to bring data to the table but not be paralyzed and instead be actionable and solutions oriented. I thank the secretary for how much I have learned from him, but also how accessible and engaged he has been in the role for the Commonwealth. He also has always, in my view, put together a really thoughtful and unflappable team, and so I also want to thank Blair Brown for her partnership, particularly over the last couple of years. What can I say? 3 other things. One, it has been like a source of pleasure for me to watch the evolution of the agency over the last, say, approaching decade. There is so much more data use as evidenced today. There has been, in my view, a shift in not just the language but the mindset to sort of from what began appropriately as sort of training and compliance to what is now a TA-like agency, right? A service agency. And finally, as we saw today, most recently, sort of this trying to balance and finding the balance between the agency as connected to 9,000 plus licenses and a universal kind of large system and doing the targeted policy work. And that's a really difficult terrain and a really important one. It's also the source of many opportunities going forward, as we have talked about over the last many months, in terms of retaining a talented and engaged workforce, innovative recruitment to get more talented, engaged educators, continuing to implement that more viable a more viable and innovative but sustainable funding model, given, again, what we saw today, to drive that robust system, all in service of improving access and quality at the same time, accelerating that access, improving that quality. In that way, it's been such a gift for me to be able to see all of that and to witness what I think, secondly, is that EEC time that Amy, the commissioner, referenced recently. So yes, 22, action-packed, so much work. That has been my experience the whole way through, and it has been inspiring and humbling to watch this tiny agency do monumental things on a regular basis, especially through COVID when it mattered so much. Those decisions were so significant, and it is this team and many others who gave us the chance to support that really important work. And finally, I'll just say that I've said this before in a lot of different ways, but in so many respects, I can still today think of no more important and foundational work to be doing to support children and families, but as a social and economic driver, as a practice for a stronger day-to-day living for everybody in the Commonwealth. If we are raising the next generation through high-quality care, partnership with families, and the day-to-day interactions that will drive their little minds and bodies to develop into people who thrive, then I just can think of no more important work. So thank you all for this opportunity, for sure. And I just so look forward to watching what's still to come. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.